Hi again then guys, and welcome to another specific look at a specific car in the world of Gran Turismo Sport. And funnily enough, as you'll notice if you look at the Milo at the bottom of the screen, as weird as it may sound, and it probably does sound very weird, this is actually the first time I have ever driven this car, or at least it was when I recorded the video, since day one. I had never driven the Porsche Cayman in Gran Turismo Sport yet. 6 months, and I've never got around to driving it. Now, this was the only Porsche that I hadn't driven, and it wasn't that I didn't like the car or didn't think it would be any good. In fact, I suspected it would be one of the best options in the Group 4 category, because purely going on track record, the Porsches are all strong. The 911 GT3 RS in particular is one of the strongest road cars in the game. Some, in fact quite a few people, would say that it's OP in some ways. Yeah, I could totally agree with that and see why people think that way. It's an excellent choice to go for. The RSR is a really good choice of race car, and of course the 919 Hybrid's popularity kind of speaks for itself. With the Cayman, for me it was just one of those opportunities where I knew that I'd get around to it eventually. I knew that I'd probably like it to some degree, but I just got around to other cars first, especially when it comes to DLC. But now we've gotten around to it, so what does the Cayman actually offer for those who do choose to use it? Because just like most, if not all, of the other Group 4 cars, it's 350 grand, or of course you could wait to win it. So what do you get for that? Well, you get a Porsche badge on the front, which may sound like a gimmicky thing to say, but that actually does mean a lot. Because if anything goes about Porsche so far, they haven't been into the franchise for very long, but they're good. They make a good name for themselves, and for good reason. They are very competitive cars. So just having that badge on the front is a pretty good start. Not because of the way it looks, or necessarily how good you'd expect it to be, but because of the name that it's made for itself. Porsche is one of the most successful racing manufacturers of all time, and in the game, they make great cars. So purely having that badge does mean a lot. Now, as far as the spec side of things, you're looking at a mid-mounted 3.8 litre engine, because of course the Cayman is the more gentleman's club sport kind of approach than the 911 is, but at the same time a step above the Boxster, of course. Kind of a Boxster with a hard top originally, and then it's sort of mutated and changed since then to become almost like the hardcore but still moderately priced Porsche of choice. Again, the clubman's choice, if you will. Now you're looking at just under 380 horsepower, 310 pound-feet of torque. Those are both pretty good, and it weighs 1,300 kilos. And of course that is none of which with tuning or balance of performance applied. So what can it do? And how can it be tuned? Well, as far as tuning goes, any Porsche really requires careful setup, because if you tune it a little bit off, it will have more of a, you could say, cascading effect on the rest of the handling, because of the fact that it's mid-engine rear-wheel drive anyway. I know many players struggle with mid-engine cars. They can sometimes be a little bit skittish or slippery. I would say that that's actually not much of a problem with the Cayman. Partially because it doesn't have a huge amount of power to begin with, but also because it's just a good handling car. It's as simple as that. And when you tune the GT3 RS, that's an outstanding example of a car that doesn't have a conventional engine layout, of course, rear engine in that case, which can sometimes be even more tricky. Now this one feels to me like the kind of Group 4 car that sits somewhere between an absolute seasoned pro and kind of a beginner-friendly track day toy, because it's not the most beginner-friendly thing out there. I would say that the Audi TT is very, very good in this category, partially because it's front-wheel drive, and that's very forgiving by nature. And my personal favourite Group 4 car in the game so far is still the Veyron. Not because it's necessarily the best, especially when balance of performance comes into play, but when you can tune it on your own and drop the weight to that ridiculously low level, that is when it becomes an amazing car, a mind-blowingly good iteration of the Veyron, in fact. So the Cayman definitely hasn't toppled that one for me, but once you do factor in the very important thing of balance of performance, which completely changes everything, that is when a car like a Porsche, in a similar way actually to something like an RX-7, can really come into its own. Because this is something that I've talked about before, and it's something which can easily be talked about again, and doubtless I will bring it up again in the future, because it's an important point. And it's something that's easy to be taken for granted, and that is there are certain cars, especially with certain engine types, sometimes boxer engines, sometimes rotary engines, sometimes electric cars, and sometimes gas turbines, and those tend to be the 4 best examples where a car's performance will be better than you might give it credit for based on its on-paper spec. In other words, it's a car that's better than its numbers would suggest, and that's probably a term that you've heard me use before with stuff like the RX-7, because again, rotary engines deliver an entirely different kind of performance to, say, a traditional piston engine with similar kind of spec, numbers, power, torque, even engine size on some occasions. Now with a Porsche, that kind of feels like a similar thing, but with a Porsche it goes beyond just the engine, because the engine itself, yes, is great. The performance is better than you might expect from a 380 horsepower car, given that the top speed on this one, even with full downforce, can pretty easily get up around 170 here on the Nordschleife. So that's pretty good to begin with. You lower the downforce, you can go even quicker very easily. But the thing is, the way Porsches are set up, with so much thought put into them, and also so many years of racing pedigree really liquidated and injected into every car that they produce on the road, even including stuff like their SUVs or their super saloons, well, that's why they're so good. Now, I'm not a massive fan of Porsche. It's one of those occasions, for me, like the Nissan GTR, where I have a lot more respect for it, I should say, than I do love. That's the same here. I don't love the Cayman, but you can just feel the raw potential that the car has. It's not the most forgiving thing in the world. I would expect that newer drivers might find it a little bit slippery. The front end can feel a little bit light and loose sometimes, but as long as you keep it under control with suspension settings, plenty of downforce, the right tyres, and especially the diff as well, that can make a huge difference. As long as you use the car with respect, not as much respect as something with, say, 700 or 800 horsepower, but at the same time, respect, similar to what you might give to something like a TVR, for instance, with similar kind of power, just like a TVR, it can go way beyond those numbers and give you some great victories. Now, I don't know about you guys, but this is definitely what I would say is in the upper echelons of the Group 4 category. It's a great all-rounder. Top speed, acceleration, handling, brakes. It's pretty much got everything you need across the board. The only thing that I would say about the Cayman is perhaps avoid it if you are absolutely new to the game. If you've driven other Porsches like the GT3, the RSR, not so much the 919 because that's a completely different kind of car, but the other two, in particular the 911s, or maybe if you've driven the Alpine as well, actually, because that's a pretty good equal to this in terms of how it handles, then you might be ready to try this one. It's kind of like an exaggerated version of the Alpha 4C, or the Alpine, as I said. So it's certainly worth a look. I would say it's a great choice of Group 4 car. Balance of performance can always change things, but give it a try. This is a pretty good one, to say the least. But that's it for this pick overall, of course. I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.